The army is over here, the sea is over here, and God says, I'll still provide a way. And he says, hold out your rod and I'll show you. And he parts the Red Sea. And the Israelites cross on dry land and get to the other side. And as Pharaoh is coming across with his chariots and his horses, and God lets the waters go back and he drowns them out. And you would think that the Israelites would be like, oh my goodness, God is so awesome. He is so amazing, and we have seen a miracle, and we will never deter from him. We will always believe in him. I mean, be honest, if you saw that, wouldn't you believe in God for like the rest of your life? Yeah, I mean, I would. No, 3 verses later, they're already grumbling and complaining, right? So 3 verses later, they're grumbling and complaining. Why did you bring us to this wilderness, God? There's no food, right? There's no food here. So what does he do? Moses strikes the rock. There's water. He brings manna. He rains bread from heaven for them. I mean, come on. Like, that's another miracle. So, I mean, you would think that the Israelites are going, okay, see, God, you really do provide. Our faith is restored. Well, God pulls them out of Egypt to take them to their promised land, right? He could take them on a 4 days journey to the promised land, but he doesn't. They grumble, they complain. He says, I need to work on you just a little bit more. He takes them 40 years through the wilderness. 40 years. So if you haven't arrived at your promised land yet, trust me, it's okay, because that's not the way God works. He's got to refine you. He's got to test you. He's got to see if you trust him. Right? He takes them through the wilderness. They go to Mount Sinai. That's where Moses gets the 10 Commandments, right? Moses goes up to Mount Sinai. He gets the 10 Commandments. What do the Israelites do while they're waiting? They totally abandon God, right? They start worshiping idols. And God gets angry. Moses comes down, breaks the 10 Commandments. Moses has got to go back up again. So, I mean, Moses is leading this band of, of Israelites that, I don't know about you, but if I were their leader, I'd be like, listen, they cannot follow me for like even a year, let alone 40 years. But Moses had his work cut out for him. So the books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus and Numbers, all of that is in the wilderness, this time period when the Israelites were in the wilderness. And there are so many lessons to be learned through those books. But as the Israelites are going through the wilderness, they get to the point where the 40 years, they're about to enter into the promised land. And does Moses, after all that hard work, get to take them into the promised land? He does not. He because of his disobedience, God says, I'm not going to let you take him into the promised land. Joshua is going to take him into the promised land. So Joshua, the next book of the Bible is Joshua. Joshua gets to take him into the promised land, and they live happily ever after, and they're in the promised land, right? Everything is good. Not even close. So they go into the promised land, and God says, I'm going to deliver the enemy, because there's people living there. There's people living there. He's like, nope, I'm going to deliver them. They're your enemies. I'm going to expel them. This land is your land. This land I promised Abraham, and it is yours. So they are going to go in there, and they come to Jericho as the first city. We all know what happens in Jericho, right? The walls come down. Joshua marches around those walls 7 times. The walls came down. Again, another miracle. You would think that the Israelites were like, we've seen God. We've seen God. He's made true on his promise. We're here in the promised land. He has defeated our enemies, and we're going to do whatever he says. It's really interesting, this city, because it's the first city in the promised land, and God says something very, very specific to the Israelites. He says, give me Jericho. I want all the, burn Jericho to the ground, but all the gold, all the silver, all the wealth is mine. I want it in the temple. I want it for me. It is for God. And if you notice, it's the first. And there's that pattern in the Bible that God wants the first, and he wants the best, because he wants to be first, and he wants to be your best. So the Israelites, you would think, would be obedient, right? They're not. So somebody, I think his name is Achan in the Bible, takes the gold and the silver for himself, buries it. God says, his anger, and says, listen, I gave you all of this, and all I did was ask for the first. You could have the rest. I just asked for the first. But they keep it for themselves. He keeps it for himself, and he brings on this curse, and they move into the promised land. And they have to do battle after battle after battle, because this land is already inhabited by their enemies, right? So it's a fight. And if I were, the Israelites, I'd be staying close to God, because he's the one that's going to fight for them, right? So as we go from Joshua, we go to the time of the Judges. In the Old Testament, the next book is Judges. And Judges is that time period that's pretty rough for the Israelites. So they're in the land with all of these enemies, right? And they're loving God and they're obeying God and they're winning. Well, what happens sometimes when you're winning in life and things are going good for you? You kind of forget God, right? You're like, never mind God. See, I can do this. I'm doing pretty good, right? And they would forsake their God. And God would send warning after warning through these judges and saying, nope, turn back to me, obey me. I'm what's best for you, I promise you. And they wouldn't, and so God would warn them over and over and say, I'm going to deliver you in your hands of the enemies, if not. Well, they wouldn't listen, so they'd go into their hands of their enemies. And then when you go into the hands of your enemies, what do? You cry right back out to God, right? And he's such a good and a gracious God that he would rescue them. And then they would be again, and they would go through this cycle. And then they would be great with God, and they would love God, and then they would forget God, and they would forsake God. And God would warn them and say, turn back to me, and they would say, nah. He's like, I'll let your enemies overtake you if you don't. They still wouldn't listen. He would, how many times has God let us do that? Fine. All right. Let's see how that works out for you. And they would be taken captive, and they would cry out to God. But he would always rescue them. When you read the Old Testament for yourself, all you hear is a gracious, gracious God just saying, turn back to me, obey me. I am what's best for you. I am what's best for you. And so they would go in through this cycle, through the judges. This is where you see Samson. This is where you see Gideon. So after Judges, we have 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. This is the history of Israel as a nation. So they're in the promised land, and Samuel is the prophet. And 1st and 2nd Samuel talks about where the people of Israel are now saying, okay, we want a king. All of the nations around us have a king. We want a king. And God's like, I'm your king. Remember, I pulled you out because you're going to be set apart. You're going to be different than the other nations. I've called you to be different. And they're like, nope, we want a king. So what does he do? Says, okay, let's see how that works out for you. So he gives them a king. First king of Israel is King Saul. Good, King Saul. See, good class, I know. King Saul was the tallest. He was the strongest. He was good looking. That was the king that he had for him. And Saul he started out really good. He loved God. He worshipped. But what happens is Saul got too prideful. Saul got too full of Saul. And he ends up becoming a wicked king. And God says, I'm removing Saul. I am going to bring in a new king. And this king is one of the kings that, if you've never even been in Bible study, this is the king that you know of, which is King David. Now, King David was the little shepherd boy, right? God tells Samuel, I'm getting a new king. Go to Jesse's house, right? So he goes to Jesse's house. Jesse lines up all of the brothers, and he says, nope, not that one. Nope, not that one. Nope, not that one. Nope, not that one. And he's like, God, I came to Jesse's house. Where's the king that you want me to anoint? And he asked Jesse, he says, do you have any other sons? He says, oh, well, yeah, I got one that he's the shepherd boy out in the field, but we didn't even call him. He's like, I'll stand and I'll wait. Go get him. And he brings him back and he says, he's the one who's going to be king. And that is King David. And I'm telling you, this is when the Bible says God doesn't look on the outward appearance. He looks at the heart. David's the one that wrote the Psalms. He was the one out in the fields that was with the sheep, that was, protecting the sheep, loving God, and writing those Psalms. God saw that, and he anointed David as king. And you're not even invited to the interview. And imagine how he must have felt. And you see the issues he has with his brothers when he goes to kill a giant. We all know that story, right? In 1 Samuel. David loves God, and he says, nobody's going to mess with my God or our people. And he just goes with a slingshot, right, kills the giant, cuts off his head. Nobody else could do it. Well, they start loving David more and more and more and more because he does all of these wonderful things. And Saul starts getting more jealous and more jealous and more jealous. And so for pretty much the rest of those 2 books, Saul's trying to kill David, right? So, and it's a pretty interesting, story. David is so good. He could have killed Saul so many times, but he doesn't. He honors and respects God. Eventually, Saul is killed, and David is now king. And they lived happily ever after, and now we have a wonderful and perfect king, and God's people are, no, not at all. Okay, so then David, as we all know, was a wonderful king of Israel. However, there is one story and one event in his life that kind of everybody remembers of him and Bathsheba, right? Him and Bathsheba, he commits adultery, he commits murder for her, and the wages of sin is death. The baby that Bathsheba and David were to have ends up dying. But God is a redeemer. He gives him another son, and now this son is going to be the next king of Israel, and this is King Solomon. Solomon is the one that has written all of these books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Songs of Solomon, and Lamentations. Solomon was the wisest man, right? In fact, when David, his whole life, that's all he wanted to do is build a temple for God, build a temple for God, to build a place for him to dwell. And because of his sin, God says, no, just like with Moses, no, I'm not going to let you do it. I'm going to give it to your son. So Solomon is going to build Solomon's temple. And Solomon's temple is built in the Chronicles, and you can see in fact, in our Old Testament class, we talk about, opening night at the temple in Solomon's temple is amazing. It's crazy. God shows up, fire, smoke, everything. It's pretty awesome. But Solomon gets to build this massive, massive temple for God. So now everything is great. They all lived happily ever after. God's got his temple. His people are there. They got a great king finally, right? No, that doesn't happen. So Solomon is human too, and he is the one that marries wives from other nations. He starts bringing in other gods and other idols, and one thing God will not do is share his glory with another god. He will not. He absolutely will not. So what does he do? Is under Solomon, there is a civil war, and Israel divides into two. And if you see on this chart, we have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom up there. The northern kingdom keeps its name Israel. The southern kingdom is called Judah because the tribe of Judah, the main people were the tribe of Judah in there. And God delivers them, the Israelites, into captivity. And that is right here where it says 70 years of captivity, where all of those prophets start writing, right? God, even though God puts them in captivity or they're overthrown by their enemies, he still sends prophets to speak to his people and says, turn to me, obey me, come back to me. That's all he's saying to his people over and over again. And they don't listen, and they keep rebelling, and so they're in captivity under their enemies. This is where we're going to sit for a minute on the book of Daniel, because Daniel was a prophet during that time of captivity. Daniel was a prophet. He was taken into captivity with the Babylonians, but he stood up against the Babylonians. All of these prophets are the ones that are the mouthpiece of God during these times. The end of the Old Testament ends with Ezra and Nehemiah. So that last 70 years, God prophesies that King Cyrus is going to take over Babylonia, and he's going to let the Israelites go home. So they go back to Israel. Ezra and Nehemiah rebuild the wall, right, around Israel, and they start to rebuild a nation. Now, a lot of those Israelites, though, didn't go back to Israel. They loved Babylon so much, they stayed there, which we're going to talk a little bit about today of why and how easily that happens. But that's really the end of the Old Testament. God sends the Israelites back. They rebuild a wall. And through this whole time of the Old Testament, God is promising a Messiah. God is promising a Savior. He is saying, I will never abandon you. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. I am going to send someone to rescue you. And who is that rescuer? That's Jesus. So 400 years of silence. And listen, New Testament, Jesus comes on the scene, and it rocks their world. It's changed history. Think about it. It has changed history. Even if you aren't a believer or even aren't a Christian, the life of Jesus Christ has changed history. Our time is built on history. You go through any art museum, the life of Jesus changed everything. For us as believers, it changed everything, right? Sin now has no place. God dealt with sin on that cross. He tore the temple veil from top to bottom, and he said, there is now a relationship with me and my people through the blood of my Son, and then he gives the Holy Spirit, and then the church is born. And that's where we are on that timeline, right? And then Revelation's going to talk about the end times. But that is your timeline of your entire Bible. I think Pastor Anthony would be quite proud right now. He would be like, that's right, girl, that's right. They know their Bible. So you can go home today knowing, I think I just learned my whole Bible today. So I'm happy to do that. And you know what? I'm telling you, in my Old Testament class, they'll tell you we would do it every single week for 8 weeks, and we'd get up and we'd write it because it is so important. I'm telling you, when you get in the Word, you let that Word get in you. It gets in you every time, and every single one of these stories and these events is when God comes through for His people. He is such a faithful God. He's such a faithful God. So today we're going to sit on Daniel. And the book of Daniel, if you turn to it, it is right after, the Psalms are about in the middle of the Old Testament. It's a little bit after that. But I'm going to go through the book of Daniel with you. So Daniel, actually the timeline of Daniel can be divided into two parts. The first half of Daniel is his life. How many of you know Daniel the prophet? What are some of the things you think of when you hear Daniel the prophet? Daniel in the lion's den, right? We were on our way here today, and we were talking about that, and they're like, are you going to preach about the lion's den? I'm like, I'm not going to teach. They're like, well, that's the best part. It is a really great part. But yeah, Daniel in the lion's den, right? So we talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the life and the pressures that Daniel faces while he's in Babylon. He is one of the captives of Babylon that is writing about what God is doing while the Israelites are in captivity. So that's the first 6 chapters, and that's really usually we ever study of Daniel. The second 6 chapters are about the end times and about Revelation and prophecy. He had some major prophecy that I'm telling you link totally with Revelation. So next week, if you've never studied Revelation, you're going to want to be here because we're going to study the second half of Daniel and how it ties to Revelation. And it is awesome. I'm telling you, it's awesome. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about it today. So the first 6 chapters of Daniel, if you have your Bibles open, or even if you open them up on your phone, they'll probably have little headings, right, above the book of Daniel. In fact, in my Bible, and this is why I always tell people, get a good Bible that you like to read, a Bible that is easy for you to understand. I read out of the NIV just because when I was saved, I'm telling you, it's the same book sitting right here. I'd lift it up, it would probably fall apart. But it's the book that I got right as soon as I was saved. And I just went to my church's bookstore. Is the first one. I thought it was pretty. And I got it. And who knew that this would be the book that literally has saved my life? So as you read through it, reading those titles can help you kind of get an idea of what that book is about. So when you're studying the Bible on your own, like those, my Bible has like a summary of that book right at the beginning, and it tells me, when it was written, who it was written for, and it just gives a nice little outline of the entire book. But for the first 6 chapters, I'm going to go over what they are, and then I'm going to come back and sit and teach on one specifically. But I really would like us to understand what was going on with Daniel before we get into this instant of his life. So Daniel chapter 1 starts out where they're in Babylon. These are teenagers. They're 4 teenagers, and they are taken into captivity in Babylon. And basically the king of Babylon was we're going to talk a little bit about it, but it was a huge, huge region. They had taken over Israel, and when they took it, they always took the best, right? The best looking, the most intelligent, the wealthiest, and kept that for themselves. So these 4 young men come into Babylon. It's Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And in chapter 1, they're tested. Do you guys remember this? This is where the Daniel fast comes from. They come and they want to remember the Jewish culture. They were set apart. They were different. They didn't eat the same things the other nations did. They didn't do the same things the other nations did because they were set apart. They were separate. And so they go to Babylon and they're like, we can't eat these things. We can't drink these things. We can't do these things. And they stand up to the king and they say, just give us vegetables and water and we'll be just as good as if we had eaten the fine meats. So they test them in this, and they actually become stronger and better than everyone else. So that's why that Daniel fast kind of comes from that, because it is these 4 men that stood up to the king. They're rewarded. They have all of this understanding. They get promoted among the nation of Babylon. So chapter 2. we move into chapter 2, and this is Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar, I might just call him King Neb because that's a really long name, but he has this dream, and nobody can interpret this dream, right? And he goes and tells all the astrologers and all of the people of the land, come and interpret my dream, and they come and say, well, tell us the dream and we'll interpret for you. And he's like, nope, you have to tell me the dream and the interpretation. And they're like, well, nobody can do that. And so he said, off with their heads, and he kills them all. So Daniel hears this, and he's like, oh, great, we're going to die, or I got to interpret this dream. And that's another theme that you'll see through the whole Bible, the dreams and the interpretations of dreams and how God uses dreams. And I always say that as you're studying the Bible and you hear any of these themes, make your own Bible study. Get in the Word for yourself and say, God, show me. Start looking. There's so many resources online just to put in dreams. And, with Joseph in his dream and Daniel and his dreams. There's a lot here in Daniel. But this first dream, he goes to King Nebuchadnezzar, and he basically says, not me, but God will reveal it. And he says, this is your dream, and this is what's going to happen. And so it's the statue. If you've read the book of Daniel, the head of gold, the chest of silver, the thighs of bronze, and the feet of iron and clay. We're going to talk about that interpretation next week because it does tie to end times as well. But anyway, long story short, Daniel is promoted. The king says, thank you so much. You are so awesome. I'm going to put you as the head of you and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Chapter 3 is the fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to bow to Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar. They are going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. We'll talk about that in a minute. Chapter 4 is where King Nebuchadnezzar has this dream of a tree. And it's basically his downfall. Daniel interprets it. It happens. And the dream is fulfilled. Chapter 5 is another one that, if you are thinking of Daniel and the lion's den and the fiery furnace, chapter 5 is the one where, have you ever heard the phrase, I see the writing on the wall? Right? This is the writing on the wall. So what happens is after King Nebuchadnezzar dies and his son takes over, he forgets, right, about the God of Israel and goes and takes one of the goblets, one of the cups. And again, that's going to tie to Revelation, but he takes one of the cups and he drinks from it, and a finger starts writing on the wall. And he writes this prophecy on the wall, Mene Tekel Perez. I'm telling you, Pastor Anthony would just be geeking out right now. He'd be like, that's right, that's what it said. And it's basically saying, your days are numbered. I have weighed you on the scales, and you've been found wanting, and the kingdom is going to be taken from you. And that very night that he dies, the kingdom is taken away from him, and King Darius from the Medes now takes over Babylon. And in chapter 6, the new king, King Darius, is tricked, right? Daniel, they set a trap for Daniel, saying that if he prays, then he's going to be thrown into the lion's den. And chapter 7 is Daniel in the lion's den, and God saves him from that because he doesn't back down. He does not bow to Babylon. He stands up for Israel and the one true God. So that's Daniel's first 6 chapters in a nutshell as well. So I think we got a good background there. When Daniel's in Babylon, though, this Babylon is something that is through the entire Bible. Have you ever heard, Babylon and all these other different places? And I thought I wanted to sit just for a few minutes on, what is Babylon? Has everybody's heard of what Babylon is? Have you been to a museum and you've seen artifacts from, the ancient world of Babylon? Well, Babylon really was a place, right? It's modern-day Iraq, about 55 miles south of Baghdad. So if Iraq is here and here's Saudi Arabia and Israel is right here, it spanned all through Iraq, the Near East, Israel, and parts of Saudi Arabia. That was Babylon. It was massive. It was massive. It was wealthy. It had palaces. It had entertainment arenas. It had thriving businesses. It was the wealthiest of the wealthiest nation on earth. In fact, if you go to Google Earth, you can see, this is a picture from Google Earth. I just did Google Images. This is a picture of Google Earth. In the bottom left-hand side, you see a marking of a massive tower of where the Tower of Babel was. In fact, when we talk about Babylon, that's the beginning of where that system of this extravagance and this system without God started. Because what happened in the Tower of Babel? Anybody kind of remember? That's right. They're trying to build a tower to God, basically saying, we don't need you, God. We'll be our own God, right? Babylon is a system. Babylon is a system basically saying, my system without God. It is a man's system, political system, religious system that takes God out of it. It is a symbol. That Tower of Babel is the symbol of man's rebellion. And basically, that's what they're trying to do, create their own heaven. And doesn't that remind you of Satan in the garden, right, when he told Eve? That's exactly what he told Eve. Why be God? You can be God. You can be worshipped. You don't need God. That's Satan's trick through all the Bible. You're going to see it all the way to Revelation. But in Genesis 11, we have the Tower of Babel, and it's a counterfeit to anything that God is a part of. So it is a system. And in fact, if you think about it, it's a system we see today, right? Any system that basically says it's man-centered and not God-centered, right? We see it today. It's our secular humanistic system that we have, right? God is out of it. God is out of schools. God is out of churches. God is out of everything. No, we got this. That's Babylon. That is Babylon. And God will destroy it. God destroys Babylon. Spoiler alert. Okay, Babylon is also called a harlot. Now, I did, note to self, not do Google images for harlot. So I'm not going to put a Google image for harlot. I started trying to make, some pictures with all of these slides, but I couldn't do it with this one. Yeah, Babylon is basically a prostitute to the true church. It's spiritual prostitution. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about it next week with Revelation. But Babylon is very, very prominent in Revelation because God is going to finally take care of Babylon once and forever. That system that basically takes God out of it and puts man first. In fact, in the end of Revelation, it kind of reminds me of, have you ever heard anybody say, there's so many wars and there's so much tragedy in the world. Where is God? Why hasn't he shown up? Think about it, like genocide and wars and all of this destruction and this evil that is going on in our world. Where is God? Why isn't he taking care of that? Oh, he does. He absolutely does. He will take care of it. And that is going to happen in Revelation. He has to deal with man's rebellion once and for all, and he will. And it's going to be on the judgment day. He will deal with man's rebellion. In the end, he calls Babylon a harlot, and Jerusalem is called the bride. They're both cities, but they're also systems, right? Babylon is the false church, a false system. And that false church and that false system has a false leader. If you go back to, the Tower of Babel with Nero, he is a picture of Antichrist. You come to Daniel's Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, he is a picture of Antichrist. He is the leader of this false religion. And trust me, in the end, in Revelation, there is an Antichrist. It is throughout the whole Bible. All right? So I put on there that the Babylon is the harlot that represents spiritual prostitution, being unfaithful to the true bride. Isn't that like the perfect picture? God really makes that visual in Revelation. So I want to I was going to read just a little bit about what else Babylon is. Babylon is doomed. Babylon is, in the end, doomed. And I know you probably can't read it because you all are such good students. You brought your Bibles and you're going to read along with me. But 11% of Revelation is about Babylon and the destruction of it. God is serious. He is going to destroy Babylon. He brings his judgment, and this is what he says. Chapter 18, verse 1. After this I saw another angel coming down from heaven, and he had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. And with a mighty voice he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a home of demons and a haunt for every evil spirit, a haunt for every unclean and detestable bird. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries." And then I heard another voice from heaven say, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Give back to her as she has given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Mix her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torture and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts, I sit as queen. I am not a widow, and I will never mourn. Therefore, in one day her plagues will overtake her. Death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. Let me tell you, it's not good for Babylon in the end. She is going to get a double. All of those wars and genocide and evil things that that system has done throughout history, in the end times, double on her. Double judgment is going to be on Babylon. So Daniel's Babylon, if we go back to the book of Daniel. Oh, I love this in Isaiah. Sorry, really fast. The Babylonian motto would be something like this. In Isaiah 47, he says this: You have trusted in your wickedness, and you have said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and knowledge mislead you when you say to yourself, I am, and there's none besides me. That is Babylon. And this is what we see. This is what we see today. It's nothing new under the sun. It's been going on all through the Bible. Okay, so Daniel is in Babylon. We're going to sit on chapter 3 today. We're going to talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and standing up against the Babylon system and what happens there. So, chapter 3, verse 1 through 7. If we were in class, I would call on you and you would read for us. You would stand up, right? I would let you guys all take turns reading it, but we're not in a classroom today. So I'm going to read for you, but just follow along. We're going to go through, this is where Daniel's friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have to stand up to King Nebuchadnezzar. So chapter 3, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image 90 feet high, 9 feet wide, and set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. All the important people, right? All the important people, just to see how important and awesome he is. Babylon. All right, so the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials, they assembled for this dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed this: This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that God Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship, he will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, and all kinds of music, all the peoples and nations and men of every language, they fell down and worshipped the image of gold that the king Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And at this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. And they said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, and the pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold. And that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of the gold that you have set up. And everybody knows that somebody with an ego as big as King Nebuchadnezzar, them's fighting words. So what does he do? Furious with rage, King Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harps, the pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? So I love that he gives them one more chance at least, right? Let's see. I'm going to give you one more chance. Bow or die. This is their response. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he doesn't, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." This response is a response of people who have predetermined, right? They didn't step aside and go, let's have a meeting. What are we going to do? Are we going to bow, or are we going to risk our lives for this? No, they knew from the beginning that if it comes to this, we will die. We will die for it, right? Our God is able. He's totally able to do it. But even if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow. How many of us would do that, right? I mean, maybe we would say it in the comfort of our own homes, but if we got pulled right to that furnace and we're looking at it, would we? They did. And this is such a wonderful example of what we must be doing in our own Babylon, right? Standing up for what we believe in. Already decided we will be loyal to Christ no matter what. I'm going to come back to this verse in just a minute. But if you've read the story, you know what happens. But this is the best part right here. In chapter 3, verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was furious that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered that furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men that wearing the robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. And the king's command was so urgent and the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing fire. So the fire is so hot that it burns the guards, but not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They fall into the furnace, and look at what happens. Verse 24. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw in the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." And he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing fire and furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. I almost think that maybe God needed all of those people, all the important people, to witness this, right? They saw that the fire had not even harmed their bodies, nor the hair of their heads were singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than worship or to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." This instance in the Bible is so important to me. In fact, if you could look at my Bible right now, I probably have so much writing, a few teardrops, a couple of notes. I've got red, I've got black, because I have gone back to these verses so many times. We live in Babylon, right? In fact, we were talking about it right before the service, life is hard. Living in Babylon is hard, right? We are going to go through the fire. We're going to go through the fire. And just one of the things that I love about this story that God reminds us is that there's 3 things that God will do in the fire. He will either save us from the fire. How many times in your life have you about to go through something and God has saved you from it, right? And we all like that one. We're like, God, just save us from the fire. Save us from the fire. But how many of you know, too, that God doesn't always save us from the fire? He sure doesn't. But what does he do, just like in this story? He walks through the fire with us. He delivers us through the fire. He's never going to leave us. He's never going to forsake us. We live in a very sinful world. We live in Babylon. And he is not always going to deliver us from it. He's going to deliver us through it. One of my favorite things that I always say, to students or anyone really is the only way out is through. The only way out is through. It's just like when I remember when I was pregnant, I was having a baby. I was like, okay, and labor came. I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. Done with this. Can we just? And I literally remember thinking this is like, can I push pause and stop? I don't want to do this anymore. And I remember them saying, sorry, honey, the only way out is through. You got to go through this to get out of it, right? And that reminds me of God. So many times we go through the fire and we want him to deliver us from it, but he doesn't. But he always goes through the fire with us. So he either delivers us from the fire or he delivers us through the fire. And sometimes he delivers us by the fire. And that means he uses that fire to take us home with him. This verse actually is something really, really special to me because of something that I went through. And I want to share with you because, this church and this church family is very special to me. Like I said, a year ago, I spent 8 weeks here. And I am telling you, every single week after we were done teaching, the people would stay and we would talk more and more and more about God and more about the Old Testament and more about the things that God was showing them. And it was so amazing. Losing your pastor has been extremely difficult for me as well, and I know it is for you. And I'm telling you, I really believe that I'm here for a reason and for a purpose to encourage you. That God is going to walk with you through this fire. He is going to walk with you through this fire. I promise you, I promise you, I promise you. He used this verse in my life about 10 years ago. We lost our pastor. Pastor Howe was like, we loved this pastor. It's where my kids grew up. They went to Awana. I taught Bible study there. I was good friends with his wife, and he had cancer. And again, it was about 10 years ago. And I remember praying hard. He's going to survive. He's going to live. We're believing God. Saturdays. I'd even go up on Saturdays, up to the church. And we'd pray and we'd pray. This was for a year. And I just believed God. I just knew he was going to heal him. We knew he was going to be saved. And he died. And I remember thinking, what? No. The God of the Bible is able. I know him. I know he can do this. I know he can. I know what he's done in my life. I've seen miracles in other people's lives. No, this did not just happen. I know God can do it. So that brought another question then. I know God's able. But did I know God was good? Did I trust him to be good? So I remember I was angry. I don't know what anybody else is going through, but I'm just going to be really transparent. I was ticked off. And I'm telling you, I was mad. I was so mad at God. I was so mad. And I remember thinking, God, you are able. You are totally able to do this. So why wouldn't you do this? Why wouldn't you save this man of God? And he brought me to this verse. I actually was teaching a Bible study called Believing God. And I walked into church to teach this Bible study called Believing God. And I remember saying in my head, well, I'm not believing God, though. I mean, I'll teach I believe in God, but I am not believing God. And you see this, God? I am angry on the inside, and I am not believing you. And I was just so mad. And he brought me to this verse. And I was going through this study. And he reminded me, sometimes he just doesn't do things our way. And he said to me in my heart, and he said, I am God and you are not. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, is that what I was thinking? Because that's what I was doing. I was praying my will, not his. And we have to trust that he is God. And we are not, even when we don't understand. So when I was reading this verse, where he says, where the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, man, these words, still to this day, I remember it. They said, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we're thrown into that furnace, The God we serve, he's able to save us. Oh, I was okay with that. I knew God was able. But was I ready for that? No. But even if he doesn't, what do you mean even if he doesn't? No, he's going to. No, but what if he doesn't? But what if he doesn't? That's where I was. But even if he doesn't, are you still going to believe in him? Are you still going to believe that he's good? Even if he doesn't. That's what they said. But even if you don't, he's still good. And he's going to deliver us. He's going to deliver us. Now, they didn't know. It could have been through the fire or by the fire, right? It was either going to be, they're going to be burned. That's probably what they thought. That we're going to be burned alive right here. But to live is Christ and to die is gain, okay? That's great if we live here, but guess what? If you kill me, then I'm just going to be in a better place. And that's the whole point of it anyway. We were meant to be back with our Creator, right? So as I was going through that time in my life, I just remember saying to God really humbling me and saying, you were praying your will. Did you ever pray my will? What about my will? And I was like, oh, gosh. All right, let me tell you something. God knows how. And he's so gentle and he's so good. You know, at Pastor Anthony's celebration of life, Pastor Jennifer said something, and I wish she was there with me 10 years ago that she could have said it to me. She said, and I can't remember who it was that said to her, I think maybe one of her children said, why didn't God answer our prayer? And she said, what if he was answering his? And I thought about that, and I just think about that, is that he is God, and we are not. He is a gracious and a good God. He knows. His ways are higher than our ways. Who are we to tell God who can live and die? We can't. We can't. It is for him alone. And he will use those fires to strengthen us. He will use those fires, I'm telling you, from that point on. And I remember I had to say it audibly. And it took every ounce. You know when you're mad at someone and you're like, I forgive you, fine. He said to me, he said, I know you know I'm able, but do you believe I'm good? And I went, and I'm against everything in me, the sadness and the anger. I said, I believe you're good, God. And from that moment on, something broke in me. And I have always remembered that. I have always remembered that God is good, even when I don't understand it. Even when he gives me a no, he's still good. He is still good, and he has been good ever since then. So when I was thinking about, and praying about, God, what's the message for this family? I love this church. I've made so many good friends in here that, just by studying the Word with you guys, I have loved so much every part of this journey. This verse is what I give back to you, is, do you believe not only he's able, but do you still believe he's good? Because he is. And he may be taking you through this to show you that, to show you how good he is and that he is God. And when you can fully trust him, when you can stand up there and say to live as Christ and to die as gain, right? You hear those stories of those martyrs. How can they do it? Because they know he is God and we are not. And so I leave that message with you. I encourage you. I pray for you guys daily. And I know Pastor Anthony would want you to get in the Word. Let the Word get in you. Go out and be disciples for the church. His words will live on. His words will live on. I'm telling you, in fact, Pastor Jennifer, if you're listening, I made you a shirt too. His words are going to live on. And he was an event, and that's what he wanted for his church and for his flock. He wanted you to go on and live out that beautiful legacy that he had. Let's pray. Dear God, I am just so thankful for your word. Your word has changed me. And God, I pray right now that this word has changed the hearts of the people here. And as the worship team comes up, I know we're going to go into a time of response. And God, people can respond right there where they are. Maybe you're talking to them and you're saying, trust me. Trust me. You're telling them to just trust you. You're telling them what they need to do to get through this. That you are good. You are good. You have a plan. You have a perfect plan. And God, I just pray over this church, this family, for Pastor Jennifer and her family, that they know that you are good. Even when the answer is a no, even when it's an answer we don't understand, you're still good, and that we trust you. And that we trust you. And that's all you ask, is that we love you and we trust you. And so as the worship team as the worship team, I was putting back up my prayer. I want to pray one prayer over you as the worship team is coming and as you're coming up. This is my prayer over you. It is Moses' words to you. Moses said to the Israelites, I set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life. Choose life.